channel. I'm Tiffany, and this is the Very Vintage Vagabond. I created this channel because I love anything and all things vintage, and I hope that you do too. So I wanted to start this off with my first vlog being about women's rights and the right to vote. Hence, this is being our 100th year since the 19th Amendment was ratified. I find it very interesting that it took over 100 years of women fighting for the right to vote until they were able to. I think a lot of people are under the impression that these women fought for a little bit and then they had the right to vote, but it actually started with Abigail Adams and John Adams' wife. Well, he was away in Boston writing the Constitution with all the other guys. She wrote him a letter to remind him to not forget about the ladies. She wrote, "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your own ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Abigail Adams was kind of a badass. So it started 100 years prior to 1920, around 1820, 1830. There were a lot of reform groups being made here and there, not only here in America, but across the pond in England. And women's voices were becoming more powerful and gaining more force. Women didn't want to be known as really a household object. They were technically a slave in their own home. They found a husband, which is what you had to do if you wanted to do anything in your life, because you needed someone to create that environment of a home and money coming in, because women back then typically didn't work. It was frowned upon. If you didn't have babies by your 20s, you were a spinster. Women were more than that. They didn't want to just be household items that cleaned and cooked, had babies, pleasured the men, and had no voice. They were done. And so to start, they said, let's have the right to vote. This will give us that stand that we need to start moving forward. And so it took the back burner during the Civil War. But again, the Civil War came about because the black people were not being treated equal. They were slaves, literal slaves, being beaten to death, not paid, obviously. So when the Civil War came around, the women's rights took a back burner so that the civil rights could come forward. After the war and the 15th Amendment was placed, then the women's rights kicked back up. But women's rights, civil rights, human rights, even though they're their own entity, they're going in that same direction of everyone should be created equal. So the women's rights movement started gaining momentum. Women everywhere were marching, and not only marching, they were loud. There were some women known for their anger and their violence, and they wanted their voices to be heard. And to do that, they had to make huge statements. And some of these women that we know, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, they were huge names in the women's rights movements. And what they were fighting was something known as the cult of true womanhood, which was the idea that only a true woman was pious, submissive wife and mother, concerned with only family and house, anything that was nurturing or domestic, and that was it. So anyway, so finally in 1848, women had their very first women's right conference in Seneca, New York. Over 300 women came, and some men, and what was signed that day was known as the Declaration of Sentiments. That right there was the big thing that started propelling this forward even faster. So in 1849, Elizabeth Blackwell is the very first female doctor to graduate medical school. So in 1851, there was a former slave, now free, woman, now fighting for women's rights. Her name was Sojourner, and she gave a speech called Ain't I a Woman? And that was in the Women's Rights Convention in Ohio in 1851. I'll put it down below in the description so that you can read it. It was very powerful. And then in 1869, the women got together between the American and the National Women's Associations. They came together and they created the National American Women's Suffrage Movement. Part of the women's rights and the women's right to vote was the women's right to do what they wanted with their body. This came from Margaret Sanger in 1916. She did open up the very first birth control clinic. It was shut down. She then, in 1921, opened up the Birth Control League, which then became Planned Parenthood. And then in 1917, again, before women could vote, Montana had their very first House of Representatives be a woman. Her name was Jeanette Rankin. And then in August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment is made, ratified, and placed in the Constitution. Big moment for us. Just stemmed us forward, really. Now we have the right to vote. What else? Of course, we weren't considered equal yet. Oh no. No, no. There would be more and more movements and more strong women in our history that would come forward and lead us to allow us to be able to do what we wanted with our bodies. We could decide when we wanted to have kids. We could go into the workforce. Eventually, finally, maybe not so much in some areas, but closer to equal pay. And really being told we can do whatever we want. But the fact that we're still having that conversation, we're still having to promote that women can be anything. They can be astronauts and presidents. It's still not equal. It's still not where it needs to be. Thanks to these women and everything that they did and the suffering that they did, we were able to vote. And not only vote, but that moved us up. We were able to now start fighting for more rights and more things that made us equal to men. Women's rights is huge. It's huge next to civil rights and really just basic human rights. So I hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed making it. Base really quick on my hair. So 1920s Gibson style hair. So the Gibson girl, created really by a man by the name of Charles Gibson, on what a woman should look like, with the full bust and the little waist with the high hair. It was the ideal of what a woman looked like. Now, Gibson girls were considered to be very strong-willed ladies, but they really wouldn't have anything to do with the women's movement because that was just too much for them. So they were more concerned on image and beauty. So anyways, but this is the Gibson girl look. Sometimes they wore them with, a lot of times if they went out in public, they'd have big hats with feathers and ruffled shirts, high collars, cameos. Those are all indicative of the 1920s. After the right to vote, though, women started getting a little bit risque. Long hair was considered the true woman value. After women had the right to vote, women started chopping off their hair. Then you get the flappers, the wild girls, and so maybe I'll do a piece on that later. I don't know, but anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, subscribe below and look forward to my next video that I'm doing next week. Is a 1920s recipe in the kitchen. That's it for today. Thank you so much, vintage friends. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, you are awesome in every single thing that you do.